So this is a bit of an experiment. I'm calling it nerd stuff. I'm not talking about an entire column. I'm not recounting or recontextualizing a previous column. I'm just kind of talking in a free-form way about something from American political history that I know a lot about. I'm not necessarily going to have lots of fancy graphics or anything all that visual, other than me here, obviously. It's gonna be more akin to a podcast, I guess, except here, as a video. I know this is a normal thing that people do, but it's a little new for me, and I'm just giving it a shot. And if you guys like this one, I'll do another, and if you like that one, I'll do another, and you can even suggest topics for me to tackle. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's get started with this episode. If you spend any time whatsoever on the political side of TikTok, you will hear people debate endlessly about something called the party switch. All right, I lied a little bit about the graphics. I like that title. Party switch is this idea that at some point in the mid 20th century, basically the 1960s, the Republicans and the Democrats switched places. The Republicans became the conservative party, the Democrats became the liberal party. The Republicans became the party of white Southerners and specifically of opposition to civil rights, and the Democrats became the party of civil rights. It's not hard to see why this is a divisive topic on social media because, for one, it paints an entire political tendency as basically being hostile to the civil rights movement. And for two, in its broad strokes, it sounds a little far fetched. What do you mean the party switched places? Does that mean that particular lawmakers switch places? Does that mean that they swap platforms or positions? What does that mean exactly? And unfortunately, as is often the case on social media, a real phenomenon, like a thing that actually happened, gets oversimplified into a version that does sound a little fantastical. And the version of the party switch, quote unquote, that is often litigated on social media is not really all that accurate. The Republican Party didn't go from being a liberal party to a conservative party. The Democratic Party didn't go from being a conservative party to a liberal party. The Democratic Party prior to the 1960s wasn't uniformly opposed to civil rights, and the Republican Party prior to the 1960s wasn't uniformly in favor of civil rights. Although we can point to some particular lawmakers who switched parties in the late 1960s and 1970s, I'm looking specifically at Strom Thurmond, the South Carolina Democrat who became a Republican. Although we can point to those kinds of examples, there was no broad phenomena of Democrats becoming Republicans and Republicans becoming Democrats. So, was there a party switch? Kind of, sort of. It depends on what you mean by switch. One of the things it's important to understand when thinking about history in any context is that you're both looking for breaks with the past, you're looking for change over time, but you're also looking for continuity because that's how human societies work. There rarely are circumstances where there is a total hard break. It's often a slow and gradual change, which means there's often quite a bit of continuity with things that came before. And this is especially true in the context of American party politics. The idea of the party switch at the end of the day is this idea that there was a hard break at a certain point, that the parties became fundamentally different things in the 1960s. But what that completely misses is the extent to which there is real continuity with previous iterations. That the Republican Party that emerges in the 60s and 70s and 80s has actually quite a bit in common with the Republican Party that existed in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And likewise, the Democratic Party that emerges in this same period in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s has quite a bit of continuity with past iterations of itself. And although there is change, change is happening. That change is very much within the context of a set of political traditions, which remain fairly stable over time. Not totally stable, but like there's real stability there. And so for this video, we're going to talk about the party switch, but we're going to talk about it more as a gradual transformation over time and not one that begins in the 1960s. This story of how the Democratic Party did become uniformly liberal and now the Republican Party became uniformly conservative, and which is really a story of how the particular demographics and voter bases of these parties changed after the 1960s. This story begins not in the 60s, not in the 50s, not even really in the 1940s. It begins, if you want to really put it this way, all the way at the end of the 19th century in the 1890s. I know this is going to be a bit of a longer discussion, but it's not going to be super long. So there's going to be a bit of simplification here. For the sake of simplification, there are a couple things happening in the 1890s in American politics. One of those things is what's called the Agrarian Rebellion, the populist movement you may have heard of, the Populist Party you may have heard of. This is a group of mostly farmers, but also some industrial laborers who come together under the banner of the Populist Party to fight for inflationary monetary policy. That's the free silver you probably remember from your middle school or high school civics classes, and greater democratic control over the financial economy for the sake of improving the livelihoods for farmers and laborers. The Populist Party more or less fuses with the Democratic Party in the 1890s, in the 1896 presidential election. It's essentially a Democratic populist joint ticket led by William Jennings Bryan. And this movement attempts to beat back monopoly capital. It doesn't succeed. The winner of that election is very much the candidate of monopoly capital, which just means the large financial interests headquartered in New York, Boston, those sorts of places. A Republican represents the emerging and soon to be dominant strain within the Republican Party, which is this business conservatism, the politics of the shopkeeper, the politics of the financial manager, the politics of the banker. This was middle class, reform minded in some respects, but focused mostly on maintaining price stability. This was also a Republican Party that hadn't quite repudiated its civil rights and anti slavery past, but had definitely put it in the rearview mirror. The old abolitionists were long dead. The Unionist Republicans, who led the nation in the 1870s, had faded away. Although one of them was elected president, that's James Garfield, he was assassinated. This Republican Party could still claim the support of those Black Americans who could vote on the basis of this party still kind of being the party of Lincoln, but it wasn't so keen to be the party of Lincoln anymore because, in pursuit of a national governing majority, it didn't want to alienate the white South. It wanted to be a reconciliationist Republican Party that could put the war and secession behind them. The other thing happening in the 1890s is, of course, the rise of Jim Crow. Now, we can do a whole other video about the rise of Jim Crow, about why it doesn't arise immediately following the end of Reconstruction, but takes basically 2 decades to really come to full fruition. But by the end of the 1890s, Jim Crow is more or less the law in much of the South. Plessy v. Ferguson, the case in which the Supreme Court affirmed separate but equal, is decided in 1896. And states in the South are passing Jim Crow constitutions which mandate segregation and destroy voter participation, not just among Black Americans, but among white Americans as well. Now, the dominant party in the South is the Democratic Party. It redeems the South from Reconstruction in the 1870s and 1880s and goes on to establish basically one party dominance that's going to last until the 1970s, just about. The Southern Democratic Party, the Segregationist Democratic Party, has its roots, of course, in the party of Andrew Jackson, the party of slave owners. And accordingly, it is quite conservative across many dimensions. It is hostile to labor, hostile, obviously, to civil rights, hostile to federal intervention because it sees federal intervention as a wedge that could threaten the control of economic elites in the region over Black and white laborers alike. This southern wing of the Democratic Party is in an uneasy alliance with the Northern Democratic Party, concentrated in the nation's cities and urban areas, with a strong base among low wage laborers and immigrants. This Northern Democratic Party, this really urban machine Democratic Party, was much more interventionist, much more interested in using the federal government such that they could to pursue social aims. And as the progressive movement gets going in the early 20th century, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, you see these urban machine Democrats begin experimenting with all kinds of social programs that would eventually become part of the constellation of efforts that became known as the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, being the governor of New York before becoming president of the United States. Now, I mention all of this to establish this point about continuity. The point of walking through the Republican and Democratic parties in the 1890s is to just illustrate something. The first is that the Republican Party in the 1890s, although it does have this civil rights legacy, is beginning to become this business conservative party that we recognize. And the Democratic Party is split between a segregationist, genuinely conservative Southern wing and a Northern wing, which is very heterogeneous with many different interests, but broadly is in favor of some measure of tolerance in the social world and federal intervention, such that people were thinking about the federal government in those terms in the economy. And Progressivism as a movement at this time cuts kind of across both parties, kind of across ideology, because it's very much focused on the scientific rationalization of government. There are conservative progressives, you could say, like J. Edgar Hoover, and there are obviously liberal progressives like Woodrow Wilson, who wants a more interventionist federal government and is part of and helps create what we know as the administrative state. All right, so where does all this party switch stuff come in? Now that we've established that both parties have elements of them that should be familiar to us today, we can start focusing on what's happening with the voters. The Democrats have the southern wing, which is not the largest wing of the party, but acts as a single coherent bloc, and then these other parts of the party throughout the country, in the West, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, everywhere. And the Republicans, likewise, are largely concentrated in the Midwest, on the West Coast, in what we call the Mountain West, and in New England. Although there are a smattering of Republicans in the South, mostly in places where Black Americans can still cast a ballot. Not very many places. World War One starts to change that, but changes that mostly because of one thing: mass population migration. The U.S. enters the war in 1917 on behalf of the Allies, and there's all of a sudden a huge demand for industrial labor in the northern centers. Some of that labor is coming from immigrants, but a lot of it is coming from Black Americans traveling up north in the first wave of the Great Migration. They're settling in places like Chicago and New York, Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Detroit, all throughout the industrial Midwest. An interesting thing is happening as they're moving from the South to the North. They're moving from a place where they had very little political freedom to a place where they had quite a bit more. If you saw the movie Sinners, this is actually part of the plot of that film. The Smokestack twins are from Chicago. They grow up in Mississippi. They go to Chicago after the war in which they fought, and they return to Mississippi. The return, not so common, but that pattern of maybe going up to fight the war or going up to do war-related activities and settling in one of these big cities was very common. You have these Black Southerners in these northern cities that already have these large urban machines, and they are just another constituency within these urban machines. And although there's plenty of prejudice and plenty of racism that's happening, these are still potential voters, and these machines need to appeal to them. And so, sort of for the first time, or the first time since really the 1870s and 1880s, you have Black Americans becoming the objects of a political party. Democrats in these cities need to somehow integrate these Black Americans into their machines to win their loyalties and to win their votes. In the 1920s, Black Americans are still voting for Republicans, but it's beginning to change. It's beginning to switch. You see more Black Americans beginning to vote for Democrats as a result of this outreach by urban machines. And in 1932, when Roosevelt is on the ballot, and the Depression has virtually wiped out the Republican Party, you see a huge movement of Black Americans towards the Democrats. And this begins a process of Black Americans becoming part of the actual national Democratic establishment and not simply a group to appeal to by these urban machines. You see Roosevelt meeting with Black American leaders like A. Philip Randolph throughout his presidency. You see those Black American leaders beginning to look at Roosevelt and the larger Democratic Party as both an institution to pressure, but also potential allies, especially these Northern Democrats who are coming out of these cities, coming out of this machine tradition, and understand that Black Americans are part of the constellation of groups they have to work with. As the 1930s becomes the 1940s, we also get the ideological pressure of the war. The war, recognized at the time as the war being a war for democracy, a war against Nazi racism, against Nazi fascism, against Imperial Japanese fascism. And although there is plenty of American racism fighting in this war, there are also many Americans who look at American racism, see it as a problem for not just propaganda, but for what the country allegedly stands for. So you have young Democrats like Hubert Humphrey up in Minnesota, who, as he is entering into national leadership, making a plea that the Democratic Party needs to be a better partner to its new Black constituents, needs to reach out to these Black voters, needs to stand for civil rights in a real way, both as a commitment to its own ideals as the party of democracy and for straightforward political reasons to secure the allegiance of Black Americans in tight national elections. This brings us to 1948, when, after a tough floor fight, Humphrey successfully puts a civil rights plank into the Democratic National Platform.
We have made progress. We've made great progress in every part of this country. We've made great progress in the South. We've made it in the West, in the North, and in the East. But we must now focus the direction of that progress towards the towards the realization of a full program of civil rights to all.
With the assistance of A. Philip Randolph, and to the somewhat dismay of Truman, although he does embrace it in the end. And Southern Democrats, led by Strom Thurmond, break off in the Dixiecrat Rebellion in an attempt to discipline the National Democratic Party. Their thinking being that if we can tank Truman in 48, then we can remind them that we are the decision makers in this party and that we say no to civil rights. Truman wins, handing a victory to civil rights Democrats and beginning a schism, a real schism within the Democratic Party between its southern and northern wings. In the 1950s, with Eisenhower serving his 2 terms, Eisenhower is making inroads into the South on the basis of sort of a growth platform of republicanism, but they're still basically a detente in terms of who is appealing to black voters. Many black voters still voting for Republicans, but again, the Democratic contingent is growing larger. And Richard Nixon, a California Republican who seems to have a sincere commitment to advancing civil rights, Nixon attempts to revitalize Republican standing with Black Americans and makes a vigorous effort to win over Black Americans in the 1960 presidential election. But Kennedy, JFK, plays the game a bit better, wins the support of Martin Luther King Jr., and helps deliver Black American voters even further into the Democratic camp. Lyndon Johnson sort of cements this with the Civil Rights Act, of 1964, which simultaneously brings Black Americans en masse into the Democratic Party and pushes quite a few white Southerners out into the Republican Party. And this is when we get into party switch territory. But what's really happening here is a demographic switch. It's Black Americans becoming Democrats after decades of slow movement, and white Southerners becoming Republicans after decades of slow movement. By 1968, the white South is moving quite rapidly to the Republican Party, and the nation's black electorate no longer concentrated in them. In the nation's black electorate, North and South is moving or has moved rapidly towards the Democratic Party. This obviously isn't an instantaneous process, and there are other things happening as well. As many writers have covered, Nixon, in his second iteration, recognizes that there's quite a bit of resentment against the civil rights movement and how it's evolved into Black Power and other slogans and movements. And Nixon tries to capitalize on this by appealing to the prejudices of not just white Southerners, but like white ethnic voters in the North. Here, he's following the lead of George Wallace, the Alabama governor, who enters the national stage as an ardent segregationist, but realizes, in his words, that the whole country is Southern and that he can run a sort of anti-Black platform and policy message nationwide, playing on these resentments and fears.
When the sit-in demonstrations and lions in the streets all over the country started, Mr. Nixon and Mr. Humphrey both, in recorded statements, said, "It is a great movement. It is a great lie-in. It is a great demonstration. It is a great sit-in." And now it's culminated in anarchy throughout the country, and now they come along and tell you that we recommended it, but now we're going to save you by calling for law and order. I say that those who led us into it ought not to lead us out of it, because had they not given lip service to this anarchy in the streets 8 years ago, it would be safe to walk on the streets of Oklahoma City and of Tulsa and of Los Angeles and of Birmingham and the other large cities of our country.
Maybe the best book written on Wallace as this sort of epochal figure in American political history is The Politics of Rage, George Wallace, The Origins of the New Conservatism and the Transformation of American Politics by Dan T. Carter. You can also read Rick Perlstein's Nixonland about the Nixon part of this, and he goes a lot into Wallace as well. I have a copy of Nixonland around here somewhere, but I don't remember where it is. And if you want some discussion of just the Southern Democratic Party and its relationship to national politics, here's Carter again, from George Wallace to Newt Gingrich, Race in the Conservative Counter-Revolution, 1963 to 1994. It's focused on the present, but there's a lot in there about the past, so recommend this too. Anyway, what we see here are movements of populations, groups of voters shifting in response to differing circumstances and events, and obviously, and political entrepreneurs like George Wallace and Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson making their own efforts to win over voters and change the political landscape. Now, has there been a party switch? Kind of, right? Because Through the 1970s, the Republican Party is growing more conservative and the Democratic Party is growing more liberal. But again, this liberalism in the Democratic Party has clear antecedents. It's part of a tradition stretching back to the late 19th century. And likewise, the growing conservatism of the Republican Party, the growing conservatism of the Republican Party, and especially its economic conservatism, has clear antecedents stretching back to the late 19th century. What happens, essentially, is that in jettisoning its white Southern wing and gaining a large contingent of black voters, the Democratic Party aligns its longstanding economic liberalism with a social liberalism. And on the flip side, Republicans, in receiving a large number of white conservative voters, North and South, but especially South, begins to align its business conservatism with a social conservatism. There's a lot happening in the 70s, especially the growth of the religious right, the evangelical right specifically, is also shifting the contours of what social conservatism looks like in the Republican Party. Roe v. Wade in 1973 galvanizes many conservative voters to take a stronger position in questions of public morality. So too does the movement against the Equal Rights Amendment, galvanizing social conservative voters and again evangelicals in particular into political action. And there's a lot to say about the rise of evangelicals as a political faction as opposed to strictly a religious one. But even as voters are shifting between the parties, political allegiances haven't completely transformed. Yes, you have a lot of white Southerners voting for Republicans on the presidential level, but down ballot, they're also still voting for Democrats, voting for the same people they've been voting for decades. And in 1976, Jimmy Carter went into office on kind of a last gasp of the New Deal coalition. Jimmy Carter, being a Southern evangelical himself, is able to win back some of these wayward voters and combine them with these new black voters to build out a majority political coalition, although a somewhat weak one, a very fragile one. This is actually a really interesting era in the history of Southern politics because, again, you have a large influx of black voters. You have genuine competition between the parties in the South for the first time in 100 years. You have Republicans contesting statewide races in the way they never had before. And you had Democrats trying to hold on and trying to appeal to new voters in a way that they've never really had to before. So the combination of these things results in a lot of interesting changes within the politics of the South. For example, this is the era where education funding becomes a big deal in the South because it's a place where there is bipartisan agreement, where Democrats and Republicans could agree in making these critical investments in state education systems. But that's, again, a separate discussion. This split of, say, white Southern voters backing Republicans for president or even for maybe senator, but voting for Democrats for down ballot, and up north, even um, liberal voters voting for Democrats on the presidential level, but voting for liberal Republicans to represent them in Congress or in their state house kind of continues through the 80s. But then we're getting into generational cohort. But time marches and people get older, cohorts change, people die, lawmakers retire. And with new voters and new lawmakers, new politicians, comes more alignment. A liberal Republican retires and a liberal Democrat tries to run as their successor. A conservative Democrat retires and a conservative Republican tries to run as their successor. It's really not until 1994, and at this point we're 30 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's not until 1994 that you're really seeing this shift begin to take place down ballot, outside the world of presidential politics. Even then, that is engendered not just by the conservative backlash to Bill Clinton, but by changes in the political economy of the United States, accelerating the industrialization of the United States, which really begins in the 70s, but begins to cascade through the 80s and into the 90s as the US policymakers embrace a set of market oriented policies that we now know or we now call neoliberalism. Changes in the nation's political economy influence its electoral politics as well and open up new avenues, new ways of doing things, new approaches. And this is what the 1994 election is. Republicans capitalizing on both narrow political changes. Again, I mentioned this backlash against Clinton, but also these larger structural systemic changes that make Republican politics more viable than they were in the past. So it's in 1994 that you more or less get a complete cohort replacement. Many of the conservative Democrats that had served a long time either lost or retired before that election, and same with the liberal Republicans. In a very real sense, George W. Bush is the first Republican president to represent a uniformly conservative Republican Party. Or to put this a little differently, his father nominated a liberal Republican for the Supreme Court. George W. Bush put Sam Alito on the Supreme Court. And that is the difference. I mean, that's a lot of things going on, but that's represents the difference in how the Republican Party becomes uniformly conservative. And the Democratic Party likewise becomes uniformly liberal in a way that it hadn't been before. Black Americans become one of the principal demographics in the party in a way that wasn't true for large parts, if not most, of the 20th century. And even still, there's still ancestral voting happening. You still have voters, conservative voters, who vote for Republicans for president, Republicans for their congressional representatives, and even Republicans for governor, maybe voting for Democrats to represent them in their state house, represent them in their localities. And it's not until 2010 that that basically ends, that finishes, that we see the last of that kind of voting. And not incidentally, 2010 is when really the last liberal Republican, Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, is gone out of office. Well, if I have this right, and I'll fact check myself when I'm editing this, I believe he passes away in 2010. The previous year, he switched parties. So that's the party switch, if you want to call it that. A slow movement of political demographics driven by events, cohort replacements, all kinds of things happening over the course of the 20th century and into the early 21st century to make the Democratic Party uniformly liberal and the Republican Party uniformly conservative. I'm sure I missed some things here. I'm kind of doing this all off the dome, but these are the broad this is basically what it looks like. And nothing ever really ends. Politics keeps happening, things keep moving. And what we've seen in the last decade is a further realignment, this one across education. Voters with college educations or more are becoming uniformly Democratic, and voters without college educations are becoming more and more Republican, mediated, of course, by other demographic characteristics such as gender and race and ethnicity. But the realignment of educated voters and less educated voters is having profound effects on American politics and even global politics. But as I keep saying, that's another discussion for another video. So I hope this explains some things. Hope you learned some things in this. And if you like this, I'll do it again on a different topic in American politics. There's a lot of them, and I'm happy to talk about as many of them as I can.